Hello, and welcome to the discussion on human rights in the supply chain. Today, we are talking to a couple of expert panelists that I'd like to introduce you to. The first one is David Uricoli, a Gherzi textile consultant and formerly of Ralph Lauren. And here with us as well is from FairTrade Italy, Paolo Pastore. Also with us today is Sung In of ADIDAS. And today we are going to be talking about human rights in the supply chain and the challenges companies face and what they can do to go beyond compliance to build a more sustainable supply and value chain. So let's go ahead and begin. With all of our panelists, the first question I wanted to ask you is, there are many aspects to human rights in a supply chain. What is your focus and what types of issues on human rights do you address within your organization?
Thanks, Sri. So obviously, one of the most important parts about human rights in the supply chain is utilizing social auditing skills to check against codes of conduct, which is really table stakes. I think anyone that is working on human rights in their supply chain should be at least checking what's going on in your suppliers' facilities. But also, you want to be sure that you understand the factory operations as they are on a regular basis. One of the things we did was really try very hard to utilize fully unannounced audits. So we were successful in ensuring that we had a minimum of 70% of all of our audits were fully unannounced. That way, our suppliers were aware of it, that at any time we would show up. We really saw the factory operating in its normal environment where nothing was really set up for our visit. But, it's really important to look beyond auditing and understanding systems of management, hiring practices, and their best practices that they use on a regular basis. What do our suppliers also do to give back to their workers? And what kind of opportunities do we see contributing to those efforts? Internally, it's essential to understand procurement practices for manufacturing, materials and trims, but also hiring. An onboarding process takes time to be diligent with all aspects of suppliers, including capacity management and preventing overloading with factory orders. But more importantly, how workers are hired, ensuring that workers are hired without paying any fees, without being beholden to anyone, and any contracts or paperwork that's signed or needed is in their language and explained to them before any pen hits paper when it comes to recruitment. No fees are allowed, and their full access to any paperwork, should they ever want to leave that employment, needs to be available 24 hours, 7 days a week. So hiring practices is something that's quite important to look at no matter what it is, whether it's suppliers that are being sought by the factory itself, by the suppliers themselves, or with workers. So it's quite important.
Great, thank you, David. Sungin, I'll go over to you now.
Thank you, Sri. So with regards to human rights in the supply chain, I'd maybe like to take a step back and look at broadly our approach to human rights in general at ADIDAS. And so at our company, like many companies, we recognize that we have a responsibility to respect human rights in alignment with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And we understand the importance of showing that we're taking the necessary steps to fulfill that obligation. So for the past 2 decades, our human rights and labor program has really focused on delivering on our commitment to the UNGPs through applying an ongoing human rights and environmental due diligence strategy and process in order to identify, address, evaluate, and mitigate some of the risks of involvement with adverse human rights and environmental impacts, whether that's through our own operations, through our products or services, or via our business relationships in the supply chain. And so through this human rights and environmental due diligence process, we've identified the following issues as key to our human rights program and as the focus for us to address. So in other words, they're salient issues for us as a business. And these include labor rights, fair wages and compensation, discrimination and harassment, freedom of association and collective bargaining, occupational health and safety, child labor, forced labor, and human trafficking, and key environmental salient issues, including climate change, water, the use of hazardous chemicals and waste, in addition to other business issues such as privacy, corruption, and our role as a business in sports sponsorship and how to do so ethically. So among those salient issues, my personal focus within ADIDAS is on child labor, forced labor, and human trafficking. And we broadly term that to include, the modern slavery as a broad definition. And so focusing on modern slavery within our supply chain, we first set out a very clear and strict prohibition of the use of any form of modern slavery in our workplace standards, which is our supplier code of conduct. And so that outlines a clear prohibition on forced labor or human trafficking or child labor. And that's applied across, our global supply chain and applies, of course, to our company operations as well. And we treat these issues with a zero tolerance approach. So perhaps, touching on the topic of, social compliance auditing and evaluating your supply chain, we are looking specifically for some of these risks within our supplier base. And in addition to social compliance audits, our approach to eradicating forced labor from our supply chain includes implementing a modern slavery strategy, which we first published in 2010, but is undergoing revision currently. And that outlines a tailored risk-based due diligence process, a risk assessment, regular monitoring activities and performance measurements of suppliers, and as well as designing and delivering targeted training and capacity building so that suppliers, and in fact, so everyone in the business knows and understands what modern slavery is and how to address it. So whilst human rights in the supply chain can be very broad, today I'm bringing the perspective of certainly my role and our work in addressing modern slavery risks, whether that's forced labor in its very obvious forms or through, for example, our work on responsible recruitment practices, particularly of vulnerable worker groups such as foreign migrant workers.
Thanks. FairTrade is a worldwide organization that is working in Asia, Latin America, and Africa to set a standard, a complete set standard regarding the sustainability for the commodities and global supply chain. Regarding the human rights, we're working with focused on 4 issues. In special for women's empowerment and equality, community empowerment, because we're working with the local community to create a world where the people can take a choice together to change the economy and the situation in the local way. We're working also to building a resilience capacity and to fight the climate change, because in this situation in the last 20 years, the world changed totally. And we set a standard to create a more sustainability regarding climate change for the local community. Another important topics for our operation is right access to the world commodities market. If we pay in the right way the products from the third world, from Asia, Latin America, and Africa, we can create the resources for the local development and for the access to the population to the right services and the best way to build equality in the south of the world.
Thank you. I'm going to stay with you here, Paolo, and then go on to Sungin. For the next question, what are the roles of NGOs and corporations when it comes to human rights in general, and more specifically forced labor and supply chain? Paolo, we'll begin with you, please.
Yeah, FairTrade expand its action to the new supply chain for cotton and textile. And it's important because with the right supply chain, we can create in field, in cooperation with the local NGO, cultivation and agriculture to intermediate products. And we can monitoring the final cloth production. In example, in this situation, we can operate to create the supply chain for the sports sector, in example. And in this way, I have a good example in the last months where the football team in Deutschland adopted FairTrade supply chain for cotton, textile, and merchandising products. It's important because this changed the reality of the community in the third world, and they create also more capacity for the consumer to act in the right way to change the economy.
Great. Sungin, what are the roles of corporations when it comes to human rights in general, and more specifically forced labor and supply chain?
Thank you for the question, Sri. And perhaps I'll speak a little bit about the role of how corporations engage with external stakeholders, which includes NGOs, but also broadly civil society, including international organizations. So engaging with stakeholders is a key part to any kind of meaningful human rights due diligence. And certainly it's part of the ADIDAS approach to sustainability and human rights. And we seek to ensure that we address the human rights topics that are most salient to our business and to our stakeholders, as well as looking forward to the challenges ahead. So to be able to identify those topics, we openly and regularly engage with key stakeholders and consider and take into account their views and opinions when making decisions related to our strategy or approach or activities on both human rights and sustainability. And so this active and open dialogue with stakeholders includes both local and international NGOs. It includes labor rights advocacy groups, human rights advocacy groups, trade unions, as well as additional external stakeholders like investors, government agencies, and academia. But I'd perhaps like to speak a little bit about how we use collaborations and partnerships with civil society, as well as other companies and industry associations to actually build leverage for systemic change when it comes to human rights and sustainability in our industry, whether that's addressing responsible recruitment of migrant workers or raising decent work standards, for example, in the cotton supply chain. So one example I'd like to highlight is that since 2018, ADIDAS has partnered with the International Organization for Migration, the IOM, through its CREST program, which is the Corporate Responsibility in Eliminating Slavery and Trafficking, to implement responsible recruitment practices across our supply chain. And I would say that the impact of this responsible recruitment capacity building program that we launched with the support of the IOM was broad because it also included other brands who were also sourcing material from Taiwan. And that included New Balance, Nike, Patagonia, and Lululemon. And really together through that brand collaboration, we were able to create leverage and pool resources and reach a greater set of suppliers where perhaps otherwise we would not have. And by working together, we're also more likely to sustain these efforts beyond the lifetime of the particular initiative that we embarked on with the IOM. So I think perhaps to kind of come full circle to your question, there's really a real value in a genuinely collaborative approach, whether it's with NGOs, civil society, or indeed other brands when it comes to addressing forced labor risks in supply chains and where interests overlap in a non-competitive way, right? Because it does help impact at scale.
Great, thank you. David and Sungin, I wanted to ask you the next question. There seems to be increased pressure on brands to be more ethical. Is this something you're seeing in fashion retail when it comes to human rights? And what are some of the old and new struggles of corporations related to this? And what do they need to do to address the issues? David, let's go ahead and begin with you.
Thanks, Sri. So thinking about this broad question, I really zeroed in on something that was old but has been considered new again. And I recently wrote an article about commercial compliance and how ethical behavior, honesty, fairness, and transparency play a significant role in the purchasing practices of buyers and sellers. The COVID pandemic really highlighted major increases in purchase order abuse, if you will. A purchase order is an agreement between a buyer and a seller. And a lot of times that purchase order has minimal information on it, price, product, and a delivery date. And many times that particular price, product and delivery date can go through changes after it's been confirmed. And those changes can be really unsettling when it comes to the manufacturing process. But the pandemic really put many brands and retailers under pressure from poor or no retail business. And they were forced to try and rectify what they were doing. And sometimes they refused completed orders from their suppliers, or they did not maintain financial responsibility of liabilities from production that was started or not completed, or any other variety of stages of that production being produced. The seller is usually the one putting the money out to purchase all of these materials to complete that purchase order. And that, whether they're taking a loan from different organizations, whatever the case may be, different banks, it's still their responsibility. Unfortunately, suppliers all the way up the value chain have been affected by this irresponsible behavior. So with that, as a side note, I just want to make sure I say that there were many buyers who remained responsible for their orders with their suppliers and did the right thing by honoring their commitments. But for some, it was too difficult an environment. It was an uncertain environment, so they did what they did. And it really brought up the issue of purchase order abuse and changes that are made, and really how it is very devastating to the supplier itself.
Great. Thank you, David. I don't think a lot of us think about the purchase orders when we associate that with human rights. So it's a very great explanation. Appreciate that. Sungin, I'm going to go over to you with the same question.
Yes, I think this is absolutely something that we are seeing for the apparel and footwear sector, and indeed all sectors, in large part due to the evolving regulatory landscape when it comes to business and human rights due diligence. But, regulations aside, I would say that in the past, 5 to 10 years, ethical consumers are certainly increasingly conscious of sustainability issues, and are increasingly aware of the potential impacts that they may have when purchasing an item when it comes to sustainability or human rights issues linked to the clothes they buy or the shoes they decide to put on their feet. The investor community as well, particularly with the rise in recent years of ESG as a hot topic in the investment community, is also increasingly aware of, the S in ESG and what it means for businesses to actually address, human rights and social issues in their broader business activities. So where once, human rights due diligence may have been a voluntary measure that companies could opt to or choose to take part of as part of their commitments to the UN guiding principles or the OECD multinational guidelines, the past several years and indeed the next several years will see a significant increase in human rights-based legislation and regulation, particularly laws mandating disclosures of human rights processes that extend through a company's operations and supply chain, so human rights due diligence, in other words. And in addition to disclosure legislation and increased obligations on companies to report or to know and show what they're doing with regards to human rights, there are indeed a host of new mandatory due diligence laws creating that obligation to report on how you are in fact identifying, addressing, mitigating human rights impacts. And this includes, of course, the German Supply Chain Act, which is now in force as of January 2023. And certainly with our program at ADIDAS, for the past 20 years, we've been building a robust social compliance, human rights, and labor program, which is already broadly compliant with what we understand to be the obligations of the Act. But there will be, certainly more similar laws coming forth at the EU level. And so I think perhaps the old challenge is this ongoing challenge of true traceability and supply chain transparency and addressing some of the really embedded risks at the raw material level for things like, if in our supply chain for materials like cotton or leather or recycled polyester or so on. But perhaps what a new challenge is now the speed with which we have to address these issues and the pace at which regulations requiring us to do so are coming into play.
Great, thank you. Well said. And I think the urgency of the regulations is a really great point, just that there's momentum and an urgency now that because of the changing regulations to keep up with and to make those changes happen. And you mentioned raw materials, and that sets us up for our next question, which I will pose this question to Paolo and David. What are organizations doing to safeguard human rights in sourcing raw material and in manufacturing production?
To safeguard the human rights, as Sung In said, it's very important the traceability. And in example, FairTrade can be a tool to create a right traceability from the field to the end products in the market. But it's important from our point of view also evaluate the impact in the community along the supply chain, because traceability is important, but it's a tool. We need to be able to evaluate the impact of our action during the supply chain and evaluate if the community receive a real benefit regarding the job for the global label, global brand around the world. FairTrade certification is a final target for the products, but is only a tool. We need to work together to find the right condition for the workers, for the farmers, etc., etc. The tool like blockchain, etc., is nice, but it's important that they are in coherence with the entire supply chain. It's important also that we establish together, if it's possible, a right model to sustainability for the workers and evaluate these and present to the final result, to the market, to the consumer, to the citizen together. Because if we work together, we can be stronger together in the sustainability supply chain and the human rights.
Understanding your supply chains with due diligence is no longer a best practice. It's essential. Understanding raw materials, your suppliers, is something that in the work that I've done over the years has always been part of our due diligence process. Bringing new suppliers on board, as I mentioned before, about procurement and how important that is for suppliers and their suppliers as well. So there is new legislation that on forced labor is happening all over the world, and it started here in the United States and is now a law in Germany. And you have an obligation to understand and verify your supply chain all the way up to the fields, forests, farms, ranches, or labs where your materials are initiated. It's not something that a lot of companies had thought about. It's not something that a lot of companies had done in the past. So working together and understanding just how broad this is and looking at all of the different types, identifying and documenting fiber structures by their origin is an amazing bit of progress that's happened over the last couple of years. Utilizing blockchain and tracing system schemes to document their journey to the final manufacturing locations is monumental. However, as it's been mentioned, there are such a variety of raw materials that are being used in so many different ways, whether it's trims or trim fabrications, it goes on, or even packaging materials. So I attended 2 days of a CBP technical conference with no less than 19 companies that will help you trace your journey with costly systems and subscriptions. But it is such a vast and broad topic and responsibility that companies can't do it alone. They certainly need tracing systems, particularly companies that aren't so used to working within their suppliers' supply chains. If you don't nominate a lot of these smaller suppliers, then you really are not part of that process. So I think slowly but surely it'll happen, and the finished goods suppliers will also need to be part of this process. It really takes all stakeholders that are involved in the supply chain, including tech companies, to really understand and mitigate any of the risks that are being found on whatever levels the supply chain process takes you. So it's going to take time, and as we've all established here, it's going to take collaboration with a lot of stakeholders, and also with the tech companies assisting you and helping you to document all of this work.
Great, thank you, David. I think that piece of technology goes a long way right now in how we are accountable for what's happening with the human rights in the supply chain. For all the panelists, as we know, companies have put sustainability and ESG as part of their corporate agenda. How is sustainability influencing human rights issues in the supply chain? And in the same regard, how are we seeing technology play a role?
With an increased focus on sustainability and ESG, there will naturally be an increased focus on human rights. I think particularly where issues across those two areas, sustainability and ESG and human rights, are interlinked. So I would say that a good recent example of this is linked to the historic move, I guess in 2022, by the UN to declare a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment as a human right. So this now combines what was once perhaps seen as a solely sustainability or environmental sustainability issue as a human right issue. There are also examples of human rights being linked together with climate change as a key topic. For example, applying a just transition while also avoiding trade-offs, say, between achieving that just transition and the human right to work and the human right to a healthy environment. Or, for example, the intersection of protecting biodiversity and mitigating deforestation while also supporting Indigenous peoples' rights and livelihood. And to the second half of your question regarding the role of technology, I would say that the primary role of technology in terms of sustainability and human rights is that it plays an enabling role or a scaling role in supporting companies in achieving traceability and greater supply chain transparency, which is, a key step to being able to identify human rights risks or, environmental risks as part of this broader human rights and environmental due diligence process. So examples of how technology can be an enabler may include initiatives which map supply chains and share data. One example that ADIDAS participates in is the Open Supply Hub, which was formerly the Open Apparel Registry. And this initiative seeks to provide transparent supply chain data freely in the public domain for use by not only companies, but civil society, NGOs, and indeed the workers in the factories themselves to kind of share that information to be able to understand, where can we have leverage? Where can we have shared influence? There are also, of course, a myriad of other technology companies which are offering supply chain mapping, so helping companies to address that really great challenge of how do we actually trace our supply chains fully down to the raw material.
I believe the pressure is on, and from a different perspective, looking at sustainability and ESG as part of a corporate agenda, the pressure is on, and if you are a public company or a retailer, you have been contacted by a social investment firm asking about data, asking about a low score that you might have received on a recent a survey. And there are some really great surveys out there really getting to the core of the issues and not only understanding and giving companies the opportunity to talk about what they're doing, but also proving that by what is transparent and what is being published versus what are you actually talking about, and giving opportunities for these brands and retailers to really talk about what's on the horizon and some of the things they are working on. Might not give them the best score, but I think it's a great opportunity to address issues that you may not address in your reporting of your efforts for sustainability and environmental and social and governance. So the ESG part is something that a lot of folks understand, but it's the sustainability part that really becomes personal to your organization. And where does it start? So when you really look at circularity, that really starts in the design process and understanding that design process and what really goes into it. So you've got a whole different set of stakeholders in that regard, because they're creating new products, they're coming up with new ideas and understanding how they could make a difference in these products and what the end of life of these products is like. And that end of life needs to be a renewed end of life. In other words, going back into the system and becoming either another garment or, there's quite a few options. And I think the efforts are tremendous right now. And there are so many companies doing so many great things, but yet there's other companies that are on a different journey. And, the issue of sustainability alone can be a tough one, much less one about circularity. I think you have to be a bit more mature on your sustainability journey and what your priorities are and materiality priorities, I think, are the real crux of how you start this, right? And then remain responsible.
It's difficult to speak after the last two interventions, very long and very clear. But I have some issue regarding the ESG ratings. It's important, but we hope can really change the company approach to sustainability. Also with the use of tech tools is important. But ESG is not only a gold medal. We need influencing really the global policy of the global company and really impact to the operation in field, because this is important. If we don't create the real impact in field, it's only an exercise, but not with the real impact. Just to use the tech tool, we start with the program with the FairTrade, named the FairTrade School and the FairTrade University. That will link school and university from Europe, in example, with the school university in Latin America, Asia, and Africa, where is located the producer group that working with FairTrade. And in this link, the people can exchange impression or exchange cultural expression regarding his local situation. And also the people can look where is cultivated, in example, cotton or coffee or tea, etc., etc. And the people can have a right vision regarding the real situation in field. Is a use of tech tool to create a link and also a better recognition in between the different communities. Is an option. I think it's important every company remember every day good ethics is a good business, but we need to make together. If we don't act together, it's very difficult to change the economy and the world.
So to all of our panelists, we have spent some time understanding the various aspects of human rights in the supply chain. In your experience, what is the value for an organization of having a transparent supply chain that ensures respect for human rights? We'll go ahead and start with David.
Thanks, Sri. I think a transparent supply chain is an honest one. Publishing something for the public to read and scrutinize, you need to be honest. You really don't have a choice. So I think that really ensures that a company is being honest. If not, it'll be found out. But as you work to improve your transparency, you have an obligation to ensure its accuracy. That obligation, when taken seriously, will ensure that you are using facts to show your progress, even if progress is slower than anticipated.
From our point of view, it's important that the companies considering the citizens not only as consumers, but as a partner to push in a better way is sustainability. Is a change of in the mind. The people ask for real impact and transparency of supply chain, and they need to know the real impact of his spend action. We hope the global company understand and act in this direction, because the future is in this way.
I would say that in terms of the value of an organization to have a transparent supply chain that ensures respect for human rights, the immediate value and certainly the short-term value is in meeting the increasing regulatory demands for human rights due diligence and supply chain transparency. And to meet those demands, it's really critical to having transparency in the supply chain and mapping one supply chain to ensure that there are no human rights risks further upstream that a company may not have been aware of. But I would also say that there are similar expectations, although perhaps not set in as square stone as regulations, but similar expectations from investors and consumers alike. And so from all of these different perspectives, whether the investor community, consumers, regulators, it's no longer a nice to have a transparent supply chain. It is an absolutely need to have, or, at the risk of facing potential legal repercussions in addition to possible reputational damage. That's now the cost of not having supply chain transparency and not conducting meaningful human rights due diligence.
I'd like to thank each of our experts, David, Sungin, and Paolo, for joining us today and for the valuable information on human rights, collaboration, transparency, and really giving that voice to the workers are huge takeaways for me today. So thank you for sharing your examples and your years of experience.